Part 2, Chapter 5 of The Idiot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Eva M. Martin. Part 2, Chapter 5. It was late now, nearly 2:30, and the prince did not find General Yepanchin at home. He left a card and determined to look up Kolya, who had a room at a small hotel near. Kolya was not in, but he was informed that he might be back shortly, and had left word that if he were not in by 3:30, it was to be understood that he had gone to Pavlovsk to General Yepanchin's and would dine there. The prince decided to wait till 3:30 and ordered some dinner. At 3:30 there was no sign of Kolya. The prince waited until 4 o'clock and then strolled off mechanically, wherever his feet should carry him. In early summer there are often magnificent days in St. Petersburg, bright, hot and still. This happened to be such a day. For some time the prince wandered about without aim or object. He did not know the town well. He stopped to look about him on bridges, at street corners. He entered a confectioner's shop to rest once. He was in a state of nervous excitement and perturbation. He noticed nothing and no one, and he felt a craving for solitude, to be alone with his thoughts and his emotions, and to give himself up to them passively. He loathed the idea of trying to answer the questions that would rise up in his heart and mind. "I am not to blame for all this," he thought to himself, half unconsciously. Towards 6 o'clock he found himself at the station of the Tsarskoye railway. He was tired of solitude now. A new rush of feeling took hold of him, and a flood of light chased away the gloom for a moment from his soul. He took a ticket to Pavlovsk and determined to get there as fast as he could, but something stopped him. A reality and not a fantasy, as he was inclined to think it. He was about to take his place in a carriage when he suddenly threw away his ticket and came out again, disturbed and thoughtful. A few moments later, in the street, he recalled something that had bothered him all the afternoon. He caught himself engaged in a strange occupation, which he now recollected he had taken up at odd moments for the last few hours. It was looking about all around him for something, he did not know what. He had forgotten it for a while, half an hour or so, and now suddenly the uneasy search had recommenced. But he had hardly become conscious of this curious phenomenon when another recollection suddenly swam through his brain, interesting him for the moment exceedingly. He remembered that the last time he had been engaged in looking around him for the unknown something, he was standing before a cutler's shop, in the window of which were exposed certain goods for sale. He was extremely anxious now to discover whether this shop and these goods really existed, or whether the whole thing had been a hallucination. He felt in a very curious condition today, a condition similar to that which had preceded his fits in bygone years. He remembered that at such times he had been particularly absent-minded, and could not discriminate between objects and persons unless he concentrated special attention upon them. He remembered seeing something in the window marked at 60 kopecks. Therefore, if the shop existed, and if this object were really in the window, it would prove that he had been able to concentrate his attention on this article at a moment when, as a general rule, his absence of mind would have been too great to admit of any such concentration. In fact, very shortly after he had left the railway station in such a state of agitation. So he walked back looking about him for the shop, and his heart beat with intolerable impatience. Ah, here was the very shop, and there was the article marked 60 kop. Of course it's 60 kopecks, he thought, and certainly worth no more. This idea amused him, and he laughed. But it was a hysterical laugh. He was feeling terribly oppressed. He remembered clearly that just here, standing before this window, he had suddenly turned round, just as earlier in the day he had turned and found the dreadful eyes of Rogojin fixed upon him. Convinced, therefore, that in this respect, at all events, he had been under no delusion, he left the shop and went on. This must be thought out. It was clear that there had been no hallucination at the station then either. Something had actually happened to him on both occasions. There was no doubt of it. But again a loathing for all mental exertion overmastered him. He would not think it out now. He would put it off and think of something else. He remembered that during his epileptic fits, or rather immediately preceding them, he had always experienced a moment or two when his whole heart and mind and body seemed to wake up to vigour and light, when he became filled with joy and hope, and all his anxieties seemed to be swept away for ever. These moments were but presentiments, as it were, of the one final second. It was never more than a second in which the fit came upon him. That second, of course, was inexpressible. When his attack was over and the prince reflected on his symptoms, he used to say to himself, "These moments, short as they are, when I feel such extreme consciousness of myself, and consequently more of life than at other times, are due only to the disease, to the sudden rupture of normal conditions. Therefore they are not really a higher kind of life, but a lower." This reasoning, however, seemed to end in a paradox, and lead to the further consideration: what matter though it be only disease, an abnormal tension of the brain, if when I recall and analyse the moment, it seems to have been one of harmony and beauty in the highest degree, an instant of deepest sensation, overflowing with unbounded joy and rapture, ecstatic devotion, and completest life. Vague though this sounds, it was perfectly comprehensible to Myshkin, though he knew that it was but a feeble expression of his sensations. That there was indeed beauty and harmony in those abnormal moments, that they really contained the highest synthesis of life, he could not doubt, nor even admit the possibility of doubt. He felt that they were not analogous to the fantastic and unreal dreams due to intoxication by hashish, opium, or wine. Of that he could judge when the attack was over. These instants were characterized, to define it in a word, by an intense quickening of the sense of personality. Since in the last conscious moment preceding the attack, he could say to himself, with full understanding of his words, "I would give my whole life for this one instant," then doubtless to him it really was worth a lifetime. For the rest, he thought the dialectical part of the argument of little worth. He saw only too clearly that the result of these ecstatic moments was stupefaction, mental darkness, idiocy. No argument was possible on that point. His conclusion, his estimate of the moment, doubtless contained some error, yet the reality of the sensation troubled him. What's more unanswerable than a fact? And this fact had occurred. The prince had confessed unreservedly to himself that the feeling of intense beatitude in that crowded moment made the moment worth a lifetime. "I feel then," he said one day to Rogojin in Moscow, "I feel then as if I had understood those amazing words, 'There shall be no more time.'" And he added with a smile, "No doubt the epileptic Mohammed refers to that same moment when he says that he visited all the dwellings of Allah in less time than was needed to empty his pitcher of water." Yes, he had often met Rogojin in Moscow, and many were the subjects they discussed. "He told me I had been a brother to him," thought the prince. "He said so today for the first time." He was sitting in the summer garden on a seat under a tree, and his mind dwelt on the matter. It was about 7 o'clock, and the place was empty. The stifling atmosphere foretold a storm, and the prince felt a certain charm in the contemplative mood which possessed him. He found pleasure, too, in gazing at the exterior objects around him. All the time he was trying to forget something, to escape from some idea that haunted him. But melancholy thoughts came back, though he would so willingly have escaped from them. He remembered suddenly how he had been talking to the waiter while he dined about a recently committed murder which the whole town was discussing, and as he thought of it something strange came over him. He was seized all at once by a violent desire, almost a temptation, against which he strove in vain. He jumped up and walked off as fast as he could towards the Petersburg side. He had asked someone a little while before to show him which was the Petersburg side on the banks of the Neva. He had not gone there, however, and he knew very well that it was of no use to go now, for he would certainly not find Lebedeff's relation at home. He had the address, but she must certainly have gone to Pavlovsk, or Kolya would have let him know. If he were to go now, it would merely be out of curiosity. But a sudden new idea had come into his head. However, it was something to move on and know where he was going. A minute later he was still moving on, but without knowing anything. He could no longer think out his new idea. He tried to take an interest in all he saw, in the sky, in the Neva. He spoke to some children he met. He felt his epileptic condition becoming more and more developed. The evening was very close. Thunder was heard some way off. The prince was haunted all that day by the face of Lebedeff's nephew, whom he had seen for the first time that morning, just as one is haunted at times by some persistent musical refrain. By a curious association of ideas, the young man always appeared as the murderer of whom Lebedeff had spoken when introducing him to Myshkin. Yes, he had read something about the murder, and that quite recently. Since he came to Russia, he had heard many stories of this kind and was interested in them. His conversation with the waiter an hour ago chanced to be on the subject of this murder of the Zemarins, and the latter had agreed with him about it. He thought of the waiter again, and decided that he was no fool, but a steady, intelligent man. Though, said he to himself, God knows what he may really be. In a country with which one is unfamiliar, it is difficult to understand the people one meets. He was beginning to have a passionate faith in the Russian soul, however, and what discoveries he had made in the last 6 months, what unexpected discoveries. But every soul is a mystery, and depths of mystery lie in the soul of a Russian. He had been intimate with Rogojin, for example, and a brotherly friendship had sprung up between them. Yet, did he really know him? What chaos and ugliness fills the world at times! What a self-satisfied rascal is that nephew of Lebedeff's! But what am I thinking? Continued the prince to himself. Can he really have committed that crime? Did he kill those 6 persons? I seem to be confusing things. How strange it all is. My head goes round. And Lebedeff's daughter, how sympathetic and charming her face was as she held the child in her arms. What an innocent look and childlike laugh she had. It is curious that I had forgotten her until now. I expect Lebedeff adores her, and I really believe, when I think of it, that as sure as 2 and 2 make 4, he is fond of that nephew too. Well, why should he judge them so hastily? Could he really say what they were after one short visit? Even Lebedeff seemed an enigma today. Did he expect to find him so? He had never seen him like that before, Lebedeff and the Comtesse du Barry. Good heavens! If Rogojin should really kill someone, it would not at any rate be such a senseless, chaotic affair. A knife made to a special pattern, and 6 people killed in a kind of delirium. But Rogojin also had a knife made to a special pattern. Can it be that Rogojin wishes to murder anyone? The prince began to tremble violently. It is a crime on my part to imagine anything so base, with such cynical frankness. His face reddened with shame at the thought, and then there came across him, as in a flash, the memory of the incidents at the Pavlovsk station, and at the other station in the morning, and the question asked him by Rogojin about the eyes, and Rogojin's cross that he was even now wearing, and the benediction of Rogojin's mother, and his embrace on the darkened staircase, that last supreme renunciation. And now to find himself full of this new idea, staring into shop windows and looking round for things. How base he was! Despair overmastered his soul. He would not go on. He would go back to his hotel. He even turned and went the other way. But a moment after, he changed his mind again and went on in the old direction. Why, here he was on the Petersburg side already, quite close to the house. Where was his idea? He was marching along without it now. Yes, his malady was coming back, it was clear enough. All this gloom and heaviness, all these ideas, were nothing more nor less than a fit coming on. Perhaps he would have a fit this very day. But just now all the gloom and darkness had fled. His heart felt full of joy and hope. There was no such thing as doubt. And yes, he hadn't seen her for so long. He really must see her. He wished he could meet Rogojin. He would take his hand, and they would go to her together. His heart was pure. He was no rival of Parfen's. Tomorrow he would go and tell him that he had seen her. Why, he had only come for the sole purpose of seeing her, all the way from Moscow. Perhaps she might be here still, who knows? She might not have gone away to Pavlovsk yet. Yes, all this must be put straight and above board. There must be no more passionate renouncements, such as Rogojin's. It must all be clear as day. Cannot Rogojin's soul bear the light? He said he did not love her with sympathy and pity. True, he added that your pity is greater than my love. But he was not quite fair on himself there. Kin. Rogojin reading a book, wasn't that sympathy beginning? Did it not show that he comprehended his relations with her? And his story of waiting day and night for her forgiveness, that didn't look quite like passion alone. And as to her face, could it inspire nothing but passion? Could her face inspire passion at all now? Oh, it inspired suffering, grief, overwhelming grief of the soul. A poignant, agonizing memory swept over the prince's heart. Yes, agonizing. He remembered how he had suffered that first day when he thought he observed in her the symptoms of madness. He had almost fallen into despair. How could he have lost his hold upon her when she ran away from him to Rogojin? He ought to have run after her himself, rather than wait for news as he had done. Can Rogojin have failed to observe up to now that she is mad? Rogojin attributes her strangeness to other causes, to passion. What insane jealousy! What was it he had hinted at in that suggestion of his? The prince suddenly blushed and shuddered to his very heart. But why recall all this? There was insanity on both sides. For him, the prince, to love this woman with passion was unthinkable. It would be cruel and inhuman. Yes, Rogojin is not fair to himself. He has a large heart. He has aptitude for sympathy. When he learns the truth, and finds what a pitiable being is this injured, broken, half-insane creature, he will forgive her all the torment she has caused him. He will become her slave, her brother, her friend. Compassion will teach even Rogojin. It will show him how to reason. Compassion is the chief law of human existence. Oh, how guilty he felt towards Rogojin, and for a few warm, hasty words spoken in Moscow, Parfen had called him brother, while he... But no, this was delirium. It would come all right. That gloomy Parfen had implied that his faith was waning. He must suffer dreadfully. He said he liked to look at that picture. It was not that he liked it, but he felt the need of looking at it. Rogojin was not merely a passionate soul, he was a fighter. He was fighting for the restoration of his dying faith. He must have something to hold on to and believe, and someone to believe in. What a strange picture that of Holbein is. Why, this is the street, and here's the house, number 16. The prince rang the bell and asked for Nastasia Philipovna. The lady of the house came out, and stated that Nastasia had gone to stay with Daria Alexeyevna at Pavlovsk and might be there some days. Madame Filisov was a little woman of 40, with a cunning face and crafty, piercing eyes. When, with an air of mystery, she asked her visitor's name, he refused at first to answer, but in a moment he changed his mind, and left strict instructions that it should be given to Nastasia Philipovna. The urgency of his request seemed to impress Madame Filisov, and she put on a knowing expression, as if to say, "You need not be afraid, I quite understand." The prince's name evidently was a great surprise to her. He stood and looked absently at her for a moment, then turned, and took the road back to his hotel. But he went away not as he came. A great change had suddenly come over him. He went blindly forward. His knees shook under him. He was tormented by ideas. His lips were blue and trembled with a feeble, meaningless smile. His demon was upon him once more. What had happened to him? Why was his brow clammy with drops of moisture, his knees shaking beneath him, and his soul oppressed with a cold gloom? Was it because he had just seen those dreadful eyes again? Why, he had left the summer garden on purpose to see them. That had been his idea. He had wished to assure himself that he would see them once more at that house. Then why was he so overwhelmed now, having seen them as he expected? Just as though he had not expected to see them. Yes, they were the very same eyes, and no doubt about it. The same that he had seen in the crowd that morning at the station. The same that he had surprised in Rogojin's rooms some hours later, when the latter had replied to his inquiry with a sneering laugh. "Well, whose eyes were they?" Then for the third time they had appeared just as he was getting into the train on his way to see Aglaya. He had had a strong impulse to rush up to Rogojin and repeat his words of the morning. "Whose eyes are they?" Instead, he had fled from the station and knew nothing more until he found himself gazing into the window of a cutler's shop and wondering if a knife with a staghorn handle would cost more than 60 kopecks. And as the prince sat dreaming in the summer garden under a lime tree, a wicked demon had come and whispered in his ear, "Rogojin has been spying upon you and watching you all the morning in a frenzy of desperation. When he finds you have not gone to Pavlovsk, a terrible discovery for him, he will surely go at once to that house in Petersburg Side and watch for you there, although only this morning you gave your word of honour not to see her, and swore that you had not come to Petersburg for that purpose." And thereupon the prince had hastened off to that house, and what was there in the fact that he had met Rogojin there? He had only seen a wretched, suffering creature, whose state of mind was gloomy and miserable, but most comprehensible. In the morning, Rogojin had seemed to be trying to keep out of the way, but at the station this afternoon he had stood out. He had concealed himself, indeed, less than the prince himself. At the house now he had stood 50 yards off on the other side of the road, with folded hands, watching, plainly in view, and apparently desirous of being seen. He had stood there like an accuser, like a judge, not like a what? And why had not the prince approached him and spoken to him, instead of turning away and pretending he had seen nothing, although their eyes met? Yes, their eyes had met, and they had looked at each other. Why, he had himself wished to take Rogojin by the hand and go in together. He had himself determined to go to him on the morrow and to tell him that he had seen her. He had repudiated the demon as he walked to the house, and his heart had been full of joy. Was there something in the whole aspect of the man today sufficient to justify the prince's terror and the awful suspicions of his demon? Something seen but indescribable, which filled him with dreadful presentiments. Yes, he was convinced of it. Convinced of what? Oh, how mean and hideous of him to feel this conviction, this presentiment. How he blamed himself for it. "Speak, if you dare, and tell me, what is the presentiment?" he repeated to himself over and over again. "Put it into words. Speak out clearly and distinctly." Oh, miserable coward that I am! The prince flushed with shame for his own baseness. How shall I ever look this man in the face again? My God, what a day! And what a nightmare! What a nightmare! There was a moment during this long, wretched walk back from the Petersburg side when the prince felt an irresistible desire to go straight to Rogojin's, wait for him, embrace him with tears of shame and contrition, and tell him of his distrust, and finish with it, once for all. But here he was back at his hotel. How often during the day he had thought of this hotel with loathing, its corridor, its rooms, its stairs. How he had dreaded coming back to it for some reason. "What a regular old woman I am today," he had said to himself each time with annoyance. "I believe in every foolish presentiment that comes into my head." He stopped for a moment at the door. A great flush of shame came over him. "I am a coward, a wretched coward," he said, and moved forward again. But once more he paused. Among all the incidents of the day, one recurred to his mind to the exclusion of the rest. Although now that his self-control was regained, and he was no longer under the influence of a nightmare, he was able to think of it calmly. It concerned the knife on Rogojin's table. Why should not Rogojin have as many knives on his table as he chooses? Thought the prince, wondering at his suspicions, as he had done when he found himself looking into the cutler's window. What could it have to do with me? He said to himself again, and stopped as if rooted to the ground by a kind of paralysis of limb, such as attacks people under the stress of some humiliating recollection. The doorway was dark and gloomy at any time, but just at this moment it was rendered doubly so by the fact that the thunderstorm had just broken and the rain was coming down in torrents. And in the semi-darkness the prince distinguished a man standing close to the stairs, apparently waiting. There was nothing particularly significant in the fact that a man was standing back in the doorway, waiting to come out or go upstairs, but the prince felt an irresistible conviction that he knew this man, and that it was Rogojin. The man moved on up the stairs. A moment later the prince passed up them too. His heart froze within him. In a minute or two I shall know all, he thought. The staircase led to the first and second corridors of the hotel, along which lay the guests' bedrooms. As is often the case in Petersburg houses, it was narrow and very dark, and turned around a massive stone column. On the first landing, which was as small as the necessary turn of the stairs allowed, there was a niche in the column, about half a yard wide, and in this niche the prince felt convinced that a man stood concealed. He thought he could distinguish a figure standing there. He would pass by quickly and not look. He took a step forward, but could bear the uncertainty no longer and turned his head. The eyes, the same two eyes, met his. The man concealed in the niche had also taken a step forward. For 1 second they stood face to face. Suddenly the prince caught the man by the shoulder and twisted him round towards the light, so that he might see his face more clearly. Rogojin's eyes flashed, and a smile of insanity distorted his countenance. His right hand was raised, and something glittered in it. The prince did not think of trying to stop it. All he could remember afterwards was that he seemed to have called out, "Parfen, I won't believe it!" Next moment, something appeared to burst open before him. A wonderful inner light illuminated his soul. This lasted perhaps half a second, yet he distinctly remembered hearing the beginning of the wail, the strange, dreadful wail, which burst from his lips of its own accord, and which no effort of will on his part could suppress. Next moment he was absolutely unconscious. Black darkness blotted out everything. He had fallen in an epileptic fit. As is well known, these fits occur instantaneously. The face, especially the eyes, become terribly disfigured. Convulsions seize the limbs. A terrible cry breaks from the sufferer. A wail from which everything human seems to be blotted out, so that it is impossible to believe that the man who has just fallen is the same who emitted the dreadful cry. It seems more as though some other being inside the stricken one had cried. Many people have borne witness to this impression, and many cannot behold an epileptic fit without a feeling of mysterious terror and dread. Such a feeling, we must suppose, overtook Rogojin at this moment and saved the prince's life. Not knowing that it was a fit, and seeing his victim disappear head foremost into the darkness, hearing his head strike the stone steps below with a crash, Rogojin rushed downstairs, skirting the body, and flung himself headlong out of the hotel, like a raving madman. The prince's body slipped convulsively down the steps till it rested at the bottom. Very soon, in 5 minutes or so, he was discovered, and a crowd collected around him. A pool of blood on the steps near his head gave rise to grave fears. Was it a case of accident, or had there been a crime? It was, however, soon recognized as a case of epilepsy, and identification and proper measures for restoration followed one another, owing to a fortunate circumstance. Kolya Ivolgin had come back to his hotel about 7 o'clock, owing to a sudden impulse which made him refuse to dine at the Yapanchins, and finding a note from the prince awaiting him, had sped away to the latter's address. Arrived there, he ordered a cup of tea and sat sipping it in the coffee room. While there, he heard excited whispers of someone just found at the bottom of the stairs in a fit, upon which he had hurried to the spot with a presentiment of evil, and at once recognized the prince. The sufferer was immediately taken to his room, and though he partially regained consciousness, He lay long in a semi-dazed condition. The doctor stated that there was no danger to be apprehended from the wound on the head, and as soon as the prince could understand what was going on around him, Colia hired a carriage and took him away to Lebedeff's. There he was received with much cordiality, and the departure to the country was hastened on his account. 3 days later they were all at Pavlovsk. End of Part 2, Chapter 5. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.